Today's build is asked about a lot for some reason, and that is the Summon Druid. Today we'll look at how I run the build, how you can min-max the build, and why it's generally better not to solely do summons unless you really want to play what is simply the laziest build in the game. Yes, even lazier than the Zoomancer. This is because the Summoner Druid, despite having the advantage of freely summoned minions that require no access to corpses, lacks a lot of the perks and tools that the Necromancer has, such as curses that greatly reduce enemy resistances to their damage types, and area of effect skills like Corpse Explosion to take advantage when their minions tear down a foe. That said, they do make up for it a bit by not having to get those corpses set up first, so it makes early boss battles in tight spaces a lot more reasonable since you can summon for purpose rather than having to find some source of teleport to stomp on things. Now, since we want a pure summoner for this guide, the core skills are going to obviously be the summons, which you end up putting the priority on skills themselves before any of the support abilities. The order I tend to get them kinda depends on whether I'm going through the game solo self-found or if I'm doing the late game reset, but generally the rule is central line first, then your supports, outside of 1-point wonders of course. If you're going through from level 1, you'll generally just keep investing points in that center line, and of course prerequisites as you level up, getting Ravens for early damage and some nice blind, not to mention consistent support damage. Then when you hit level 6, investing in Spirit Wolves, getting you some cold damage and such, and just keep investing in them until you get the next thing, which this cold damage will be important later. Though as you move down, you will need to get 1 point in Oak Sage, but only 1 point until you reach level 18, and it will be handy for keeping your somewhat more fragile minions, which are the Spirit Wolves mainly, alive for now. So don't be afraid to use it as a stopgap, but as soon as you hit level 18, you'll want to start investing in Dire Wolves. These will be your main damage dealers for a while, and they're much tankier than your Spirit Wolves, even without Oak Sage. So at this point, you may want to spend 1 point in Heart of Wolverine as well to get that up and running, though if you find your wolves dying too much, don't be afraid to swap back to Oak Sage. Again, only 1 point in these for now. Then as you hit level 30, it's time to invest in the big tanky summon of the tree, the Bear, and generally one I max first of the entire lot, letting the other summons sit in their mid-levels until then. This is because the Grizzly is the tankiest of the lot, and has a bit more utility early on than the other summons, thanks to this 50% chance to use a Bear Smite instead of a normal attack. After the Bear is max, it's time to go back up the tree. What order you do them in is somewhat personal preference. If you just want more physical damage on the stack, for example you have gear like Reaper's Toll or Lawbringer for your Mercenary to get Decrepify on enemies, then you just go with Dire Wolves first and just move on up. If you want more non-physical damage instead, you go for Spirit Wolves first since they deal cold damage, or if you want more battlefield control, you can go with Ravens, though personally I tend to do them last unless I'm doing a challenge run, or specifically a Raven focused run, since they don't synergize the same way with the rest of the stack. Which is worth mentioning of course. Spirit Wolves, Dire Wolves, and Grizzly actually interact with each other like masteries rather than like synergies, meaning they give each other benefits even from plus skills, unlike synergies which only work on hard points. The Ravens, however, only have these skills as strictly synergies, so they only benefit from the hard points in them, and they also unfortunately lack any synergy effect back into the rest of the animals, so keep that in mind while you're doing this. Now, you may have also noticed I have points in the vines. This is actually more for utility than anything, namely as corpse removal functions to minimize my other summons from getting distracted, with 1 point in each being more than enough for what we're doing here. And since I don't need to split off to another tree, we're fine here. That said, while I found it unnecessary, some people do like using Cyclone Armor in the Elemental tree for a bit more of a buffer on their life, but for this build, the only things that really get a bit dangerous are Gloams with their Bloody Lightning. Beyond that, you'll get touched by almost nothing. After you have all of that squared away though, you just dump the rest of the points into Heart of the Wolverine, since it will continue boosting your Bear, Dire Wolves, and Mercenary as you keep leveling it up. So it's pretty handy to have as just a damage aura, since for the most part, the summons will be tanky enough by that point that you do not need to worry about them. Now normally we do the leveling section here for solo self-found, but that's pretty much been covered in the skills because they are kind of the order you do them in. So item-wise, you go for fairly standard caster gear like stealth armor, lore, helmets, etc., with plus skills and resist being your main goals across the board, with things like lore being exceptionally handy since you can put them in druid helmets that naturally spawn with plus skills. In Nightmare, you'll upgrade to a spirit weapon for +2 as the cheapest option, and you'll also be looking for your Act 2 mercenary for some useful traits, the most obvious one being his aura. No, not might, but rather thorns. The This is for pretty much the same reason we use Thorns on the Necromancer for progress, and that is because your minion's chance to hit is going to be awful. So it's pretty much an Act 2 mercenary with Thorns or an Act 1 mercenary with an edge bow. Both are pretty solid though and relatively cheap to run. I just prefer the Act 2 mercenary since I will later be using him with a very specific polearm, whereas the Act 1 mercenary doesn't quite have an upgrade path after you get kind of the core stuff going. Now, it is worth noting that an Act 5 mercenary with Lawbringer can be handy too, but you miss out on the Thorns effect since you're not making a Bramble in solo self-found, so it's not something I'd recommend while doing normal progress. In Hell difficulty, those Thorns become even more important since it will speed up your progress through the Act bosses and even some of the more difficult areas of the game, and with the exception of certain Act 5 physical immunes, your Spirit Wolves will generally do okay at bringing down the annoying stuff like Wraiths and Insect Swarms, while your more beefy physical summons deal with, well, everything else, and the Thorns will chew up the Act bosses and melee enemies that are generally tankier. The reason this is especially handy against Act bosses is due to the fact that minions take extremely increased damage from them, so when they get melee attacked through the Thorns by these bosses, this increases damage in turn, just right back to them. So you do even more physical damage back with those Thorns. And with the modern hybrid nature of Thorns, they'll also do some okay damage back even to trash mobs. Now, in terms of endgame setups, you may notice in the background footage I'm not using some of the ever-familiar choices. This is because, frankly, they don't speed up the build much unless you're doing like Player's 8 or something like that, and by going with a lazier setup, I can get nearly the same speed with much more reasonable gear, though we will talk about a few different options. Starting with weapon choice, I'm using Heart of the Oak here for faster cast, plus skills, and resists, simply because it makes mobility a lot easier for the build, and it does help telestomping remain one of the main strategies. On swap, I have Call to Arms in the weapon swap to give me battle orders, so you can use battle command for the extra point up, but I generally only do that when I do the initial summon, since refreshing battle orders at one level lower isn't going to really make or break anything, and it is just a lot easier to just flash over, cast it, and move on. Now, there is one other common weapon choice, and that is Beast, and sometimes to a lesser extent Pride, with Beast providing fanaticism for extra damage, speed, and attack rating on your minions, though due to the flat delay between attacks, it only helps speed so much. So mostly it would only be for attack rating and damage for most use cases, which while they do speed up minion kill time, are not as significant as you would likely believe at first. As far as Pride, this is just a flat damage boost, and it does help get rid of some corpses with the ice damage, and for Pure Summoner, I just don't bother with it, though it can be fun for some of the hybrid melee summoners, though in the end I do end up preferring Sword and Board with Beast for the melee hybrid, and our choice of Heart of the Oak is just better for wind hybrid and stuff like that, while Phoenix is better for fire hybrid. Thankfully, the weapon is the only major divergence on the Summoner Druid, with Beast and Heart of the Oak being the obvious winners for most of the normal versions, and the pick being very much a mirror of just how lazy you want to be. On the rest of our gear, we're going to look more like a caster, and as such, it's easier to hybrid into Summoner Caster than Summoner Melee, despite both being actually somewhat possible. On the armor, the first pick is Enigma, and it's by far the best pick since there isn't a summoner in the game that is not greatly amplified by teleporting. It's not 100% necessary, but it is very nice to have thanks to the ability to telestomp, which locks all your minions on your location to focus down a target. Without it, you're going to be spreading out damage more and killing slower in general, but it won't really stop you from beating the game. The shield is straightforward and simple. It's Spirit, for a bit of faster cast and for teleport, some resists, and of course plus skills. It's also one of the first endgame style items you should be making, that is a Spirit in a Monarch, since it is useful for so many builds and classes and is extremely cheap to reroll to get good stats on due to the low rune cost. Helmet-wise, you do have a few options, but since this is more of a boss hunter style build, I decided to favor Magic Find and go with Harlequin Crest, though Jalal's main is pretty handy, especially if you're going to use one of the shapeshifting variants. Though for this use case, Magic Find is all I really wanted here, and there really is not a better choice for plus to all skills with modifiers we need short of maybe a GG rare circlet. The amulet is Mara's here for resist, though a solid caster or safety amulet or even a +3 magic amulet would work fine as well. We're mostly interested in the plus skills, though the plus all skills rather than the plus druid skills does help out a bit with our off-class casts of battle orders and teleport, making them a bit more useful. Similarly, the plus all skills on our dual stones of Jordans as well as our Arachnid's Mesh are good for that as well, though the Arachnid's Mesh helps us hit our 11 frame target for teleport at 99% faster cast, which makes it feel pretty Fairy, Poppy, while all three help top off our mana quite effectively, letting us not really have to worry about it at all for this build. For the gloves, we could give up a frame on teleport to get Magic Find with chance guards, but hey, while more Magic Find is nice, I went with Trangools for that frame, since I really want to have a smoother time running through the entirety of Hell multiple times before writing the guide. And while I prefer it over Mage Fist, it pretty much is just there for the cold resist, since we're not a Fire Druid, but if you are a Fire Druid, Mage Fist would be better. Over on the boot side, we don't need to worry about it at all. It's just slap on War Travelers, since there really aren't any boots that help us much unless you really need resist because you're missing them from somewhere, or you just need extra life, and really we have plenty of both with all of our gear. The mercenary I ended up with is an Act 2 Thorns mercenary with Reaper's Toll, just for the Decrepify so we can deal more easily with physical immunes, since Spirit Wolves really only go so far, and the Thorns is for the Act bosses, which the Thorns help speed up since we only have the mercenary Decrepify to help us out with damage, short of some auras. Infinity and Might would be better for trash mobs due to the chance to hit issues, while Vile Husk Act 5 Mercenary with Bramble would be slightly punchier for the bosses. This just struck a nice balance for going through the entire game. Now the charms are obviously plus skill charms, since more skills equals more power for this build, but in the long run, while this is fun to play and ungodly lazy, when I really don't feel like paying attention, I tend to prefer more right-click to win builds like the Whirlwind Barb, Strafe Zon, and Nova Sorceress. But this is fun to mess around with from time to time if you're not looking for a truly min-max speed build. So do you have a favorite lazy build? Mention it down below, and as always, thanks again for all the support, and if you're looking for some other fun builds, the ones on screen now are a ton of fun.